Hello and welcome to another episode of Spart Talk. So this is quite a special episode for me, and I hope for our fellow brothers and sisters in the working class. And that's because we recently held a workers' conference in the United States, which was organized by our comrades in the Spartacist League U.S. And this event brought together workers from across the country and also some international workers, essentially to discuss what's the state of the working class in this period and what to do. So I'm very excited to share with our listeners some of the discussions and results of this conference. And with me to do just that is one of the organizers of the conference. That's Michael Davisson, editor of Workers Vanguard, and Tom, a participant and public transit worker. So hello and welcome, comrades.
Hi, great to be here.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for making the time. So I guess the first thing I'd like to start with is why have this conference? What was the reason that Workers Vanguard or the party saw the necessity for hosting such an event?
Okay, from our perspective, we had every reason to hold this event because we have connections to advanced workers in the class, and they're under particular pressures out there in the fields. We're kind of half a year into the Trump presidency. As predicted, taxes are raining down almost every day. The cost of living crisis is raging as strong as ever. Immigrants are being rounded up in large numbers. Black workers are watching their back as kind of any program that has a whiff of addressing racial inequality is being kind of shredded. Trans people's rights have been thrown out the door, and so the class as a whole is under siege. But at the same time, there's been almost no fight back on the part of the working class, in particular, no organized fight back. And so this is both a source of frustration and tremendous pressure on advanced workers who understand the urgency of the situation and the necessity for collective defense against these attacks in order for the class to be able to steer through these dark times and to come out on the other side in fighting shape and able to actually advance their interests. So that's one side of the equation. The other for us is, as a revolutionary organization, we need to understand what the mood of the class and the consciousness of the class in order to be able to direct it towards bridging the divisions which riddle the class, in order to be able to motivate a strategy counterposed to the union bureaucracies, which is a fundamentally imperialist strategy and has led the union movement to its very weakened state today. So for us, there was kind of the two sides. One to counter that pressure on advanced workers, and two, for ourselves to be able to produce propaganda to address divisions and push back against the individualistic consciousness that is really kind of raising its head ever more strongly right now. Just to finish the thought, it's kind of the natural tendency, I think, in the working class, and it's kind of been the experience of most every worker I've spoken to, is that in the face of this uncertainty and chaos, to really kind of bunker down and turn to things that they know, and that often finds expression in kind of craft consciousness or tier consciousness or race or ethnicity. The kind of looking to one's kind of personal affiliations as a means of defense, or just simply, trying to cut a deal or trying to keep your head above water for oneself, as against what really is the only measure of protection, which is to build kind of a collective defense against these attacks among the class as a whole, and being able to motivate that in a real way based on what workers are actually, thinking is actually really important to us, because the whole purpose of revolutionaries is to be relevant to workers and to be able to show them a way forward and how to get out of the mess, right? Because we understand the only progressive solution is for workers to run industry and society, but
quite far from that. All right, well, I think that sums up everything. Goodbye. No, just kidding. I think that's a really nice motivation of exactly what we were trying to achieve with this. Maybe I can turn to you, Tom. What was your experience of this?
Well, I think some of what Michael just said is really true. It was great to be a part of a bunch of discussions over a whole weekend where like-minded workers, socialist-minded workers, and militants in different industries from around the country were able to share some of our experiences. And it is one right now, you can just imagine the horror stories we heard. And a lot of them just, shook you to the core when you find out about the staff shortages in hospitals, safety conditions, and the attacks on the working class. And as Michael said, like, there's a feeling of isolation, and there's a feeling of that our unions are not fighting back. Of course, the union tops are not doing anything. A lot of our coworkers don't believe that the unions will do anything for them. And we feel, as many workers, rank and filers, not just advanced workers, feel very, very vulnerable in this extremely reactionary period. So what we were trying to do was share some of the horror stories, but talk about the things that we can do in this period, which is going to be a period where we have to pick our shots, have to be careful on the job, have to decide how we can raise the consciousness of our immediate coworkers to get them to the point of both waging some defensive battles to save our unions, to fight against racial oppression. These deportations was a big theme, but also prepare for, a turn at some point. But things are really bad, and that certainly came through in the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just to add my own 2 cents to this, as I mentioned, there were also comrades from other countries, and that includes Britain. I attended as a participant, as did some other comrades from Germany, Canada, and also Mexico, which brought a different insight into the whole discussion. But I can say, at least speaking from Britain, very similar themes in terms of the state of where people are at, in terms of their mood, in terms of feeling like the unions are quite useless to defend them. I mean, of course, we're not experiencing ICE raids in our workplace. That's very different. But mood certainly resonates. So talking to comrades in the U.S. here, I found a lot of parallels, and I think others from Canada, Germany, etc., also found some parallels. Now, both of you have touched on this one thing, and I'd like to start our discussion by first talking about this one thing, which is the unions. Both of you mentioned or alluded to the fact that the unions are not really seen as fighting for workers, or that the union leaders have betrayed, or that there's no organized struggle. Now, what are the reasons for this? Why does that mood exist? Because in the U.S., you recently, over the last 2-3 years, had important battles. Actually, leading up to the elections, you had an important strike on the West Coast, Boeing. So, there have been battles. And I was wondering if you could maybe set the stage a little bit for this discussion about why the unions are not looked favorably to, or why they're not mobilizing their workers. Like, what explains the state of the union movement, I guess, is my question.
Well, the unions certainly are very weak and riddled with divisions and saddled with a treacherous leadership. And that leadership and its association with the liberal Democrats in particular, who in the years previous to obviously Trump's election were the main parties responsible for kind of the economic ruin and the economic pain that workers were suffering. Just to give you a sense, this period coming out of COVID, where there was tremendous sacrifice on the part of the working class to kind of dig American capitalism out of the crisis it had created, and a felt sense that we deserve something in return. And so there was actually, the working class was very restive, and probably for a good year and a half. Particular high points were the 2023 auto strike and the Boeing machinist strike. And the Boeing machinist strike is actually highly illustrative of what kind of this whole kind of dynamic, right? Because going into the strike, the membership universally wanted to you had a company which was in severe crisis on several levels. The workers really wanted to make significant gains to to kind of assert more control over what was going on in the workplace. The union leadership, though, gave some lip service to this, but in the weeks just before the strike was to happen, they announced that they were completely committed to the election of Kamala Harris. Yeah. And then they voted a really rotten deal, or they endorsed a really rotten deal, which got universally rejected by the membership, and the strike happened. And as the strike went on for 2 months or so, they effectively were trying to demobilize this struggle. And meanwhile, some of the most militant workers on the picket lines, having rejected those liberal Democrats, because they would say, hey, you should give up what you have so that this other group which is suffering can get something, that is kind of using a scarcity of resources to pit one oppressed group against another, or one section of the class against another, kind of overseeing, like I said, the kind of economic stagnation and the skyrocketing cost of living, there was a real anger and hatred. So you had this kind of combination where the union bureaucracy, which was actively pushing the kind of the liberal Democrats who were have been crushing the workers, and meanwhile these bureaucrats were strangling the struggle of these workers, that the support to Trump actually became more and more vocal among the militants on the picket line, to literally, like, the bureaucracy literally forced the end of that strike the day before the elections, although it obviously didn't help Kamala at all. But as a result, we know that a significant portion of those Boeing machinist strikers ended up voting in Trump's camp and voting for Trump. A significant shift to the right.
That's a really, really graphic illustration of literally delivering workers to Trump. Okay, so there's many themes that came up in this discussion. So I want to start talking about one of the, I guess, more general ones, which is defensive struggles aren't happening, right? We would love it if the unions were out in force defending immigrants, from these raids, like LA, what's been happening there, but also throughout the country. We need that. That's the perspective that's needed to really defend immigrants, but that's not happening. And I think what you've laid out, Michael, a little bit illustrates how the union leadership holds those struggles back and holds them back from happening. Now, I guess, you also spoke at the outset about the frustrations that workers experience about, look, this is crazy. I'm in Trump's second term and I want to fight, but my coworkers are either not willing to or don't see the point to, or, want to hunker down and do their own thing and save their own selves. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about what kind of obstacles exist, right? You laid out the mood at the start already, but what kind of obstacles? Maybe, Tom, you could answer this, right? You confront this presumably on the job on a regular basis, right?
Absolutely.
You try and talk to a coworker like, hey, look, there's ice out, or whatever else, for whatever struggle. What kind of obstacles do you confront from your fellow coworkers who you've known for some time?
Well, it's tough. We're always trying to engage and talk to people about what's necessary to make the union stronger and to fight against these different things. But I'd say just on that level, a lot of workers are fearful of their jobs. They're fearful of reaction, both by the boss and sometimes by the union bureaucracy itself, which can threaten you if you stick your neck out. And that's the kind of period we're in. I work with a lot of immigrant workers, some of whom in this particular period, they're afraid to even leave their homes or go to certain areas because they don't want to be confronted by, racists or the cops or ICE. So that fear is pretty real, the fear of maintaining your job. Then also, they feel like they're locked between support for either Democrats or Republicans. Like there's no party out there in a mass party that's speaking to their needs. They need allies. So, we do look to try to change the unions into fighting organizations that would give the backup. But there's so many obstacles, I don't hardly know where to start. But we are talking to people about it's necessary to, in this period right now, where people are hunkering down. So in a shop, like whether it's black workers or immigrants, women, younger workers versus older workers, people are starting to either hunker down in groups of people or just as individuals. For example, the consciousness that you used to have, like you don't go think to the boss or you don't try to just advance yourself at the expense of someone else, that's being replaced. Well, maybe I should talk to the boss about how I can get a little bit better, how I can protect myself, especially. It's a dog-eat-dog environment. We know capitalism itself breeds that dog-eat-dog mentality, but in periods like this, it's even accentuated. So there are real obstacles. And we could talk on a broader level how those play out, but it's a difficult period, but we need to combat that.
How do you feel yourself as a socialist-minded worker in the midst of this mood that you've described, which is not very encouraging to go in and day in, day out, face that kind of mood? How do you deal with it? Because obviously you want to win your coworkers, but that's just not where they're at. In fact, many workers are probably pro-Trump.
Well, that's okay, I can talk, over the years, I've been around long enough to know how to ride out reactionary periods and come back and fight another day, and also to not not get completely disheartened. But let's face it, say younger workers in this period, you do want to tell them that they need to learn their survival skills. They need to establish themselves as good workers on the job, which doesn't mean good workers vis-a-vis the boss, but not to be a burden to their other coworkers. So that's one aspect of it. And we also need to try to combine in every way we can for defensive workers, for, say, individuals who are being attacked. I mean, I can tell you such terrible stories. We don't necessarily want to talk about horrible stories, but there was a woman worker in my shop just recently. She was a skilled worker, and she was the only woman on a crew of like most entirely men except for her. She was forced to clean buses out of her title. And the day she told me about this, I thought, hey, I should get my coworkers together to help fight her against this just grotesque violation of the basic union contract. And instead, she told me, well, actually, I'm leaving the shop today. That's the level of despair that takes place. So we need to just think each day about how we can advance the consciousness of some of our coworkers and pick the right fights to win so that workers will regain confidence and prepare for the coming period.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have because you can go in so many different directions. Maybe, Michael, I can turn to you because you organized this. You had a political conception in mind, of like, okay, this is what the class is facing based on our, connections to it. And this is the kind of perspective they need, right? Yeah. So here you've got, for example, Tom laying out the difficulties he faces. I know from my experience, I've faced, intense periods of feeling isolated at work because I just feel like my coworkers are not where I'm at, and actually they're quite distant from where I'm at. So let me ask you about a recent issue of the paper of Workers Vanguard. You guys' front page article said, brace for impact, right?
Right.
I think we've talked enough about the mood to understand that, look, things are not headed in the right direction, and they're expressing themselves in quite horrible ways, which we can get to actually, because I think it is interesting to talk about the different ways that this mood expresses itself. But if you can just motivate, like, what is the Spartacist League as a revolutionary organization today? What does it mean to say workers brace? What was the perspective that you guys laid out for the Trump presidency?
Well, it's a recognition that Trump is on a mission, the mission to kind of tear up the previous liberal world order and replace it with a more reactionary one, better suited to where U.S. imperialism is at the moment. Having seen its world standing decline, it doesn't have the same amount of kind of room to, for the kind of liberal trappings that done it so well in the past. And so as a part of that, he's kind of looking to remake the economy from the tariffs to carrying up the way the federal government does its business institution, from universities to construction to, how it operates the post office. All of these things are kind of up for grabs now. He's tearing up all of the liberal programs like, that it pre-existed, and basically making a particular scapegoat of immigrants, of course. But there's going to be a whole series of attacks. And if you understand kind of the broader picture of why this is happening, that these attacks are not just going to stop all of a sudden, or that, a section of the working or of the ruling class rather is going to wake up tomorrow and realize, oh yeah, this is a little excessive. Let's what's really needed to put a stop to it is some kind of counterforce, a defensive counterforce that really, and to make that kind of an effective thing, what it means is kind of pulling in the largest numbers with a unity of purpose in organization. That is the working class as a collective. And so there's kind of an understanding flowing from the national international situation that this is really what's posed. Now, as we described, the class being riddled with these divisions and having shifted to the right, no thanks to the union bureaucracy, to the liberals and Democrats, a good section of that is shifted to the right. Another section is very fearful, understandably so. Others are just kind of apathetic because some of the worst of it hasn't hit yet. Bottom hasn't completely dropped out of the economy, for example. And there is kind of like what we've described as this kind of this the unions being under the leadership that they are kind of not viewed as instruments of collective defense. And so what's really posed to get to where we know we need to be, which is kind of that collective defense, to find ways to start to make cracks in that individualistic consciousness, right? And some of that means kind of looking for openings and opportunities and picking shots based on job-related issues that may well kind of pose an immediate question, but kind of cut across divisions, whether it's defending a woman worker in a lower craft on the part of male workers in a higher craft. There are some workplaces where, an immigrant union member is on ICE's wanted list. And, in those circumstances, there may well be some felt sentiment to really want to kind of get out there and do something about it. So I show that I kind of point out is kind of what can be done. But there's this kind of intense pressure too on class struggle fighters that we need to try to make something. We try to make something happen, right? Nothing's happening. We need to make something happen. And so, and I think there's a certain conception among some on the left that getting up at union meetings and putting forward a motion, let's down tools in the event of an ICE raid in our workplace, is somehow advancing the cause of the union, of the revolution, and so on. But in fact, when you haven't done anything to kind of lay the basis for support to such action, when the consciousness is that individualistic consciousness, which can take many different expressions, then you're just kind of blowing air into the wind. It's not drawing any kind of line against the union bureaucracy. This isn't an exposure against the bureaucracy. So
I'm really glad you raised that, because of course we have to talk about ICE, because that is a pressure that advanced workers are facing, and especially in the West Coast. I'm sure in other parts of the country, like metropolitan areas as well. So let's talk about that, because I know for a fact that precisely what you laid out, passing motions saying, okay, well, we're going to walk out if the ICE comes. The left does that, right? And the left does this in the unions, and sometimes they're able to pass these motions and they're like, okay, we're doing socialist work, good. And you've pointed to the weaknesses in that, the problems in that. Oftentimes, some advanced workers are leftists themselves. So I think to make the struggle with those advanced workers, I'd like if you could just elaborate a little bit. It would be great if we could pass a motion at, X workplace, say, okay, we're going to go fight for an immigrant defense committee now. Let's go, right? And that is ideal. That is what's needed, as I said earlier, but that's just not where people are at. So I could argue as a leftist from a different viewpoint that, well, you're just being a minimalist. What are you doing? You're not trying to defend immigrants. Come on, how is this socialist? So I could very easily come back with that kind of a response. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because the left does their thing, pass motions, do radical things, which are not really what we're seeing happen.
Right. Just standing up, obviously collective workplace action against ICE raids. That's the perspective in these cases, right? But the whole question, the whole kind of nub of the question is, how are we actually going to make that a reality?
Yeah.
And it's one thing if coworkers are clamoring for such action and the bureaucracy is hell no. And then, yes, you stand up a meeting, put up a motion, and the bureaucracy is exposed by its refusal. But when the workers are like, we have to protect ours to make it through, or we don't want to put ourselves in the crosshairs.
Or they think that it's good that,
or they think that their jobs, they're going to have, their families are going to have more jobs if the immigrants are hot. So what is really posed is actually making arguments that challenge that consciousness, to laying out that, this reign of terror against immigrants is going to actually negatively impact the material interests of all sections of the working class, that it's going to cause wide layers of the class to be, basically not want to stick out their heads up against the bosses, much less any attack that the Trump administration, thereby making it easier for the bosses to kind of crack the whip and kind of drive down the conditions across the board. The refusal to organize immigrants into the union movement just leaves kind of the class divided, or like I said, that collective defense was really what's going to make it most effective is by kind of maximizing the numbers. And so when you've kind of written off a whole section, in a substantial section of that of the class, you're thereby, just on the face of it, kind of reducing the potential, counterforce you can have against the bosses, against Trump's attacks. And so just kind of making a series of arguments along these lines. Like I mentioned the Boeing strike earlier. One way, they tried, Boeing very consciously played to this, knowing that the union bureaucracy was driving a lot of the workers deeper into MAGA land, was to put into the deals like new probationary periods for new hires while preserving the pension for the top layer. And the reason why they did this was because the more senior section of the workforce was wider and more U.S. born, whereas the newer, more junior layer was more heavily foreign born. And so it's kind of a very conscious thing. And so in that case, you could actually try to speak to the fact that, you persist on this course that you're talking about immigrants taking jobs. You're actually just on the face of it playing into Boeing's hands. You're playing into the very trick that the IAM leadership that they so hated, and rightly so, was also kind of feeding into. And so you have to try to find ways to exploit the contradictions in the class between, their support to the union, to their people's kind of justified need to want to kind of get out of the cost of living crisis, or their own personal situation, and understand that actually what's posed is kind of this notion of collective defense, right?
Yeah. At the conference, we did hear quite a few people talk about the creation of these committees in their own unions, against ICE raids and for immigrants. And they had their motions, and they've already realized that the motions are pretty much paper motions. There were sandboxes set up by the bureaucracy, or they were stalled for the same reason that the ICE raids in Los Angeles weren't met with a lot of working class uprising or resistance. They're really horrible attacks. Of course, on the workplace, you have people like you were alluding to, workers who actually support the deportations. They're still with the Trump program. And then there's others that are extremely fearful. And it's clear that liberalism and the whole past epoch led to this situation and created these divisions and so fostered them. And as Michael was saying, what we have to do is make not liberal arguments, but real arguments for why workers need to defend the most oppressed, in this case, especially immigrants, and show how the ICE raids and, the masked men showing up with guns, banging on your door, whether it's your workplace, whether it's your home, whether it's your hospital or your farm or something like that, that is meant to terrorize the working class as a whole. No matter what legal, illegal. You get a lot of these people say, I came here legally, and then have long discussions about how this is an immigrant country from the get-go, when all this. But also, I think the committees, which, the impulse is correct to set up a committee. The impulse is to cohere all the workers in your workplace who want to take on this issue and other issues like it. Individual circumstances, it's going to be when one of their union members is affected, or there's a raid at their own workplace, or when it's much closer to home or in their workplace, then these things can take on a real life.
Yeah.
And but everyone knows that whether you're fighting racial oppression or other forms of oppression, we've had this kumbaya moments of we're all together and just unity. It's critical to show why, like in my union, we tell white workers that it's necessary to fight racial oppression because it's lowering the wage rate. It's just blatantly lowering the wages and working conditions for everybody.
Does that make sense to people?
It has had some real resonance, Of course, a lot of now people were pulled under by the rip tides of Trumpism. Right. There's no doubt about it. So they're Latino and Black workers who you never thought would become Trumpists, or they're Trump supporters. They're seeing how things play out. At this conference, we talked a little about how deep is the, what was it called?
Buyer's remorse?
Yeah, the buyer's remorse.
Yeah, by that, it's basically, there's a regret,
amongst
the workers who went to vote Trump. Is there some regret?
There's a little pulse on that, but it's not a very strong pulse. But there's certainly people who say, gosh, I didn't sign up for this.
Yeah, it's gone too far.
But let's also not put on rose-colored glasses, or because we're still fighting these rearguard actions. We're fighting to make these arguments of, why, we have to fight segregation. You got to remember that decades of liberalism, people, their livelihood didn't get better. So the black workers who say, well, my life didn't get really much worse under Trump, and it didn't get any better under Obama. Whole sections of the country were just ravaged by the effects of U.S. imperialism. And that's another theme at the conference, how we need to fight against imperialism and workers who believe that red, white, and blue imperialism is going to benefit them.
Out of curiosity, do your coworkers understand what liberalism is? Like, what is that?
That's a good question. I think many of them do.
Yeah.
Many of them do, but they think it's like basically, it's pretty, it's the Democrats. It's phony promises, equality in name only. It's vote for me, I'll set you free, but knowing that nothing is going to come in return. Of course, more sophisticated people will sort of know that neoliberalism means like the whole period of an intent, it's everything to help out the capitalists, make the maximum profits. But most people don't think of it that way.
I think one of the themes that came up in the discussion is pro-Trump workers, which you've already started talking about. But there were also some concrete instances of exploiting that contradiction, Michael, as you were saying. Because ultimately, these are workers who are, they're going to the right, but they're doing that for different historical, political reasons because of just the way this country is run. I guess, the question of pro-Trump workers, right? Because our fellow working class brothers and sisters will be confronting that on the job. Especially, we had somebody attend from the rural Midwest, which was really cool. And that's predominantly the type of people that he confronts, right? I was wondering, what's your take on how we should be approaching Trump workers? I know you've talked about it a little bit, but this is something we confront. Let's not have the liberal knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, backward, bad person. Like, I'm not going to talk to you now. Or maybe that's the right one. I don't know. What's your take?
Well, I mean, the liberal take, of course, is that Trump voters are irredeemably backwards, and that just reinforces that they're having, they're being in the camp of reaction. And the only way you're going to, make them, make them understand that they're actually, what they're doing is working against their interests rather they're in favor of it, is to lay that out for them in a way that speaks to, oftentimes there will be some kind of underlying contradiction there. They will be the ones who kind of sense some basic value in the union, and therefore you kind of speak to how, your position, that is in line with Trump is actually on whatever the question might be, immigration or whatever, is actually, fundamentally an anti-union position. It's going to undermine the position of the union, and therefore your position, because you identify with the union. Particularly feeling the pinch of the cost of living crisis, and just kind of laying out what's going to be necessary to do that. Because there have been in the class like small isolated strikes, even in since Trump's election, sparked by the just continued difficulty of making ends meet. So that problem hasn't gone away at all. And we understand that to be able to beat that back, that no kind of workforce and kind of isolation, or one small group of workers in isolation, is really going to be able to really make a dent in that. And so again, it's like trying to understand that the same class, which is kind of weakening you by terrorizing a whole section of workers, is actually creating conditions that makes it easier to exploit you and to keep your wages where they're at as prices skyrocket. So now, having said that, obviously you make the case, but we also don't
expect
immediate results. See, it's often going to have, it's going to take some development or to kind of, I think, further to really kind of make some kind of breakthrough in that regard, because workers really learn through practice or through experience. But the thing to do is like I said, to make the argument that you're undermining your own interests by taking the position that you're taking.
Well, I think it's like, so the Trump voters, I mean, a lot of them voted for him because he was going to mix things up. Now, you do have some.
What does that mean? Mix things up?
Yeah, mix things up, mix up the status quo, which they saw getting worse and worse and worse. And their appeals, sometimes they are the more militant workers, and sometimes they're just backward. Getting on this phenomenon along the rural and urban divisions too, because remember the Democratic Party concentrated power on the coasts and in the big cities. If you're in a rural area, they really feel completely, after years of Democratic Party presidents and stuff, they feel dissed and ravaged. And then, so what we're for is workers' power and political independence of the working class. And so that can have a real deep appeal to even Trump voters who really feel shafted by both parties, but they need to understand that it's a reality. And so we have to use a lot of historical examples, but what we want to pose is genuine improvements for people's lives, and that the wealth exists, the productive capacity of society exists. But, insofar as we fail to achieve that, you're going to get more and more people who look to the right. I think we're seeing that internationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can tell. So we have to make our program really real. So, and that means not talking in abstractions to these workers. Talk about making real improvements, defending the unions. A lot of these workers are giving up on their unions too. So we face the excruciating contradiction of being the biggest defenders of the union, the most savage critics of the union bureaucracy, and trying to pose ourselves as a new and really different leadership. That's the only way, it's a work in progress for sure.
Yeah, that resonates with me, especially in Britain. I think, talking about the weakness of the unions, I think you guys are still relatively better off here compared to Britain. Thatcher was really thorough with her job. But one of the points that we've made in our propaganda in Britain is that it will take revolutionaries to rebuild the unions, right? Like to fight for most basic, somebody said in jest, sub-reformist quote things to build the unions again. Like things like, listen, picket lines mean don't cross, right? Because that was a deeply ingrained consciousness, right? I've got a comrade, actually, who was here with me from Britain, whose grandfather was a Tory, right? But was the most staunch defender of the picket line, because that's just how it worked back in the day, But that's eroded so much to the point that it's like, well, one, picket lines are totally just irrelevant or weak or totally porous, and then it's like, well, the union is telling me, hey, cross my picket line, right? So it will really take advanced class conscious fighters to fight for the most basic things, because that's what we're confronted with today. Okay, one of the other themes, I mean, we've already been talking a lot about divisions. I wanted to get a bit concrete because, as I mentioned at the outset, there are different workers from different industries as well, right? And maybe we can talk a little bit about how those divisions play out, like actually on the job. Maybe not so much politically, but actually just, we had, for example, representatives from construction, right? Trades. We had healthcare, education, transit, of course. So things like that. And there's actually lots of commonalities across those industries as well. Of course, you got the standard sort of social divisions, right? Like race, gender, age, etc. But then you got some like crazy stuff like tiers, and how that plays out. And also how workers really imbibe that and buy into that, right? Like, I got to serve my time before I can do the thing, because that's when I'm going to go make it bigger. Maybe if you can just lay out for our audience who may not be so familiar with some of the other divisions that plague the working class. That makes sense.
Certainly. Tiers is a major one.
What do you mean by tiers?
Sorry. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Basically, over time and with the agreement, often with the agreement, or always with the agreement with the union bureaucracy, the bosses in various industries, and in the U.S., it really is in most industries at this stage, would introduce new hires who had less, like their wages would be less, their benefits would be less than more senior workers, and not just because they hadn't been on the job, but they would never reach the same pay in some cases. In some cases, it would be like consciously, you have to kind of do your time for, 5 years and this, in this tier before you could graduate to the next tier. But you would be doing exactly the same work as the worker in the other, in the higher tier, or similar work. And of course, this kind of is very corrosive to union collectivity.
I mean, I know you're right, but speaking as a youngish worker myself, this is like something that we've not seen a different way of working because this has become so just how things work, right? We don't know a different way of how, like a non-tiered way of working, right? So one of the difficulties I find is I sound like I'm from Mars, where you should get equal pay for equal work, and who cares if like if you're doing this job or that job. Like it sounds like I'm crazy because they're like, what are you talking about? But like I'm more skilled or I don't know. Do you know what I mean? So I know that the tiers exist and they're a very real thing and they are also quite corrosive, as you said. But what's like, well, you edit paper, you've written propaganda on fighting tiers in specific industries, but what is a framework to combat tiers?
Well, so basically what these tiers do is they kind of create a mentality of you're climbing, you have to climb this ladder, right? And so in fact, again, it's a matter of really trying to get across that when you have these kind of different sections of the workforce, you're really letting the bosses kind of pit one section against the other so that they can give special favors to one at the expense of another. They'll express itself in concrete ways in any particular industry. You can, when those things happen, you kind of can point to them. Yeah, obviously, the workers who are on the bottom kind of understand that they're losing out because they're not getting paid or the benefits or the work hours. But the workers, you have to kind of get across to the workers on the top that they're also losing out. That this favoritism has kind of worked against them. Not only did they have to put in like decades to get to the top, but then they are also, often their bodies are destroyed in the process, and then once they're there, they're expected to work at high rates of productivity, and that it's a really bad deal for them in the end. And so it's really, you have to deal with the illusion among those who think that somehow that they paid their dues, so it needs to be this way, or that it kind of that actually, however good it might be at the top, it could actually can and should be a lot better. And the reason why it's not a lot better is precisely because they had to work through those tiers, and the bosses were able to play one off against the other, favoritism, and create those tensions and prevent that kind of struggle against the bosses that would really be able to establish. So it's really kind of trying to establish you have lost out. Although you think this is a great thing for you, you've actually lost out.
I had no hope for a long time until I saw
context
on the tier question, because I saw the tiers coming and going.
I mean, you're in transit. How does it work? Maybe
so the worst tiers are the introduction of any new tier is relatively easy for the bureaucrats and the bosses to implement because the new tier doesn't vote for the contract.
Right.
And the older tiers said that their existing wages, benefits, and protections are being held up and sustained only by paying or treating a new tier worked. And but then the new tier comes along, and many of them, like you alluded to, feel like, well, that's just the way things are, But if you've been around for a while, you can see the degradation. The reason why I'm a little bit hopeful is because there's whole strikes over the part-timer issue. Even the auto workers strike recently, which had, totally mixed, if not bad results, which could have been a game changer. But I did notice that the older workers, when they voted down the Sinn Féin contract big time. In some places, precisely because they had not gotten a wage increase or any improvement in their wages for like a decade or 12 or 15 years. And the only marginal improvements that were made that didn't even eliminate tiers were for the lower tiers. So the whole tier system is very, very corrosive. And a lot of, I ran recently for union office, and one of the things I was trying to appeal to the workers of the lower tier, and some of them did get pulled back into this notion, well, it was that way before, and it's not going to be that way again. But it's a key question. In the fight in the unions against different forms of tiers is critical because the bosses use them. And they're going to try to introduce more tiers. It's inevitable.
Yeah. And, the other thing that went hand in hand with any time the question of tiers came up, I mean, we're in the United States, racism.
Yes,
The race
absolutely.
question went directly hand in hand with that.
Yeah.
Maybe want to...
No, and then, in fact, I had meant to get around to this point when I spoke last, but often divisions like the tier division strongly overlap racial divisions, ethnic divisions in a workforce. Broadly speaking, across industries, Black workers who are generally speaking on the bottom in the society are concentrated in the lower tiers. And it really does mirror the racial hierarchy in U.S. society as a whole, thereby kind of reinforcing that racial division.
I think it points to the fact that unions, it can't just be about bread and butter things, right? Like you will never be able to bridge these divisions that totally you cannot separate the racial question from this question of tiers and benefits and wages and so on. So, the unions actively need to take up the fight to improve conditions for all workers, yes, but by specifically saying, look, our Black brothers and sisters are their needs are really at the heart of our fight, right? And I think, I think the problem, of course, the bureaucracy doesn't do this. And I think the left has a real problem. I had some discussions throughout the conference over the question of the left and, for example, the fight against racial oppression, right? That there's socialism, revolution, this is how you're going to unite the class. But if you actually confront reality and spend even a day on the job, you'll see how it's a minefield of different things, and the task is, long and arduous, but you got to really take on the divisions as they exist and try and, as you've been saying, Tom, advance a consciousness, but starting point being the actual materialist structure of society, American imperialism. That is driving down, today it might be carrying out ICE raids and not, attacking the white working class explicitly, but that's coming, right? So, yeah. One of the things, and this is my own personal curiosity, was the woman question came up as well, especially friends who came from, the construction industry. They spoke about sort of the machismo culture and attitude that often their coworkers have, like the tough guy, I'm gonna go fight for my people and fight for my family. I was just wondering also, maybe you can shed some light on how that plays out in terms of holding the unity of workers back. We've talked about individualism as a mentality right now in this period. Oftentimes that expresses itself in this macho tough guy culture, right? And that's obviously probably going to not be helpful for bridging divisions between women workers, especially in an industry like construction, which is heavily male dominated. So I don't know, maybe you could give a sense of what that discussion was like.
I can give some ideas. Well, I mean, in construction, it's pretty easy to see how they bring in large pools of young males in the main, to do these construction jobs. Any way that the bosses can intensify this macho culture of individual, I can work harder, better, faster.
Yeah, I'm not going to complain.
It literally helps the bottom line every time that they can get someone. Oh, Ben over there he can work about twice as hard as you. Look at how buff he is. Whatever the situation might be, but machismo is definitely something that helps out the contractors in a big way, and many other industries.
Yeah.
And and of course it goes and backfires against them because they break their bodies. They end up, getting burned down, and in so many ways people get horrific injuries and lose, have to leave the industry. But also more recently in this present U.S. situation, kind of Christian nationalists are trying to, massive attacks on abortion rights, on trying to drive women workers back to the home.
Yeah.
And these things are also going to, backfire. Of course, the main aim is against women workers, but it's going to backfire on male workers as well.
Thomas, I think, to describe well the machismo, and I just want to add, liberalism again has helped inflame the situation in the construction trades, like in many other, which historically have been the province of males. So a part of kind of opening them up to women workers, a good part of it is kind of liberals setting quotas in conjunction with the union bureaucrats. And so women workers who are brought into construction trades are often viewed as special beneficiaries of such programs. And that just reinforces both the machismo, the anti-woman attitudes, and the right-wing, the rightward reaction to liberalism. So it's a real, that's a kind of poisonous mix as well.
Yeah, for sure. Over the course of this conference, there were multiple breakout sessions, and I participated in one which was talking about, different types of division in the workplace. And the list, it's genuinely depressing, the types of ways in which the class is divided right now. I guess, so coming back to the start of the discussion, right, why we had this discussion, it was to try and give advanced workers in the class today a sense of, listen, this is why this is happening. This is how you make sense of what you're confronted with, and here's what to do. I wonder if you can give a bit of a sense of that. I think, Tom, earlier you talked about tampering expectations, right? Like, it would be great if we could be out in force with our union gear on and shutting down workplaces against ICE. That's just not where we're at. So what do you have to say in terms of tampering expectations? I mean, for you, this is a material question because you're back to work.
Right.
So what how do you see yourself in terms of, cut?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very critical question. Of course, things come up at work that have to be dealt with, so there can be you have to, but we do need to realize the general framework now is going to be defensive struggles. It's also a time where, so everything should be pick your shots, but also it's a time for workers to do more reading, thoughtful investigation, learning about their industry and learning about history, learning about other industries. I do think just the intellectual development of more advanced workers is going to be really important to take that time. But tampering expectations, I think people know. They know it's a tough time. They know it's a tough time. Like they may look at me and, in my recent past, like fighting, being bright red socialist at work and saying, well, maybe now it's time to temper those, like you were saying, don't put up fluffy motions in union meetings right now that cannot be acted on. So it's a time for defensive struggle, picking our shots.
Yeah, definitely. Coming back to some of the things you just said in terms of, for me, what that alludes to is broadening the perspective, right? Because in a terrible period like today, especially in working in the class, one, there's physical exhaustion, right? Then there's the, you're bombarded by kind of just things that are not pleasant. Then there's the actual conditions in the job. Everything has a very demoralizing, the direction is not a good one. And that makes it all the more necessary to have a broader perspective, right? To see things, in the long term from a historical point of view, right? Because there were periods when the unions were much more powerful. That's just not where it's at today, but that doesn't mean that this will be the case forever. And, struggle will pick up. I mean, when they don't have a choice, they will fight. That's just the nature of things, right? So I wondered what you had to say about broadening the perspective. And I'll be specific to start with, right? Because when you, Michael, when you were preparing this conference, along with the article Brace, you had this reading by James P. Cannon. It's called Our Aims and Tactics in the Trade Unions. For me personally, I've read that multiple times, but each time I read it, it's like a breath of fresh air, right? Like it really calms you down in terms of the political pressures you could be facing, because it really puts things in perspective, right? Like, here's an advanced militant worker in the union, right? What is the aim? Like, what am I doing in there? Yeah, of course I got to make a living, right? Like I need my paycheck, but also I'm fighting to win over my fellow workers to a different worldview, right? I'm fighting for socialism on the job, but that looks different. So I was wondering if you could lay out, maybe by beginning with Cannon or however you like, what is the aim and tactics? Like, what is the broader perspective?
Right. Well, it really is. Okay, so, I mean, there's an overall goal, of course. The emancipation of the working class, right? Get rid of capitalism. How are we going to get there? Well, we certainly know that the existing leadership is a brake on any and all struggle to advance the interests of workers. And it's a massive obstacle. So to counter it, what's really posed is kind of winning the hearts and minds of our coworkers. And that is kind of a process that isn't going to happen overnight. It's one that requires a kind of patience, pacing, which is part of the importance of advanced workers right now having made a push to see, to make something happen in the first, these first months of the Trump presidency, not getting a response, taking a step back and picking their shots. Okay. But because we understand this is it's a marathon, and we really are trying to win hearts and minds and not just pull stunts, right? Mm-hmm. That's not what it's about. And so that requires both kind of grounding ourselves in kind of the history of the workers' movement, the Marxist movement, and understanding what are the dynamics unfolding in the present day. Mm-hmm. And then, kind of arming our coworkers with that knowledge, right? But also looking for the openings because it is through practical experience that you'll be able to begin to kind of show that what we're saying actually does kind of bear on workers' conditions, and that actually it's a revolutionary strategy fundamentally, which is necessary to advance the immediate struggles of workers as they pose themselves. And so looking for even small opportunities to actually demonstrate that in practice, whether it's a campaign to defend the job of a victimized coworker or to, call out the boss's violation of a contract, and doing it in a way that's kind of cast in a broad way, that emphasizes this is kind of for the union as a whole. To say in the case where it's a white worker doing it, on behalf of non-white workers, that you kind of show by example that it is possible for white workers to do such struggle, to engage in such struggle to benefit other workers, that it's possible to have some kind of collective action, even if it's just a small section of the union. You're kind of setting the groundwork for understanding that actually things can and should be kind of a different way, that there is a different course, and that the union can be a fighting force for the entire membership, and more broadly for the class and the oppressed in society as a whole. Yeah. That's I thought the canon kind of really kind of lays that out. Kind of some very powerfully in a number of kind of concrete, in the concretes of the time when he was writing. Yeah.
I don't have much to add to that. I think that, but it is very, these discussions you have with, like-minded workers who want to struggle, or who clearly feel that we're at an impasse, and humanity's at an impasse, this is time to have those broader struggles. So one of our slogans that I was using for recently was "Workers must run the country," and it was very abstract to people. But when you get down and talk about how the working class can run society, how we need internationalist struggle, how we need to, bridge these divisions between industries, break down and also showing in practical ways how the Marxist program and Marxists can defend whatever gains we have, but also win even small improvements. And sometimes we're the only ones doing that. We're the only ones sometimes just telling workers, you don't have to have a meeting with the boss in the same room as you.
Yeah, nobody else is saying that.
Yeah,
and that's a consciousness that's been really eroted.
Yeah, and people don't forget those things, exemplary actions that you take. We can and we do have an impact, but we're planting seeds.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the lessons as part of my recent work, but also from this conference, is that, we're in it for the long haul, of course. But what that means also is the necessity for the advanced elements out there, the socialists within the class, to try and actually preserve themselves, their mental sanity, their physical sanity. Well, I don't know what physical sanity is, but, to preserve themselves, right? Because there is a tremendous amount of pressure, because we are socialists and we want to fight and we want to do the thing. But if your fellow coworkers are not with you, you got to go back where they are and bring them along, and that will take step by step. That's what we've been talking about. You got to bring them along, because if you're out there waving your red flag by yourself, guess what? You might get your neck chopped off, So I do think that, because, long-term work means that there will be periods where trade union work is difficult. There will be setbacks, also defeats. And I think, defeats also have their own usefulness, because obviously life doesn't proceed in a straight upward line. And defeats are also some of the times when some of the most important lessons are learned. So I think the point is we got to be with the class and not run far ahead. Be with the class, but be there to direct them towards our aim, which is workers should be running the country, the world, whatever. But yeah, we gotta go through it with the class, I guess. We can't finish this podcast without talking about the broader international situation. I think, Tom, earlier you mentioned anti-imperialism and the need at this time for broadening our perspective. I think one of those things has to be about looking outside the country, because there is a tremendous amount of pressure to just look, here's what's happening, because there is a lot happening right now. But I was wondering if you had some thoughts on anti-imperialism.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about anti-imperialism. Well, it's really another thing that we need to talk to our coworkers about, especially in the U.S. We need to have concrete acts of solidarity when U.S. imperialism runs roughshod over the entire world, which it does. It's interestingly in places like they clamped down on education workers. It was coupled with savage political repression against people fighting for Palestinian rights. And in one place in particular, Columbia University, and I think elsewhere, but Columbia University fired the grad student union president, Grant Minor, right on the eve of contract negotiations. He was not only a union leader, but he was also a fighter for Palestinian rights. And so those are coupled together, of course, deportations. But in the United States, it's imperative that people understand that the working class, the multiracial proletariat, are not beneficiaries of U.S. imperialism. As a matter of fact, just like past empires, the British Empire, in its height, treated its working class as it does today, pardon my expression, like dog shit. They give you a little flag and a picture of the king or queen to put on your wall. Other than that, no dental care, horrible wages, and savage police violence on miners' picket lines, you name it. When imperialism runs roughshod over the world, the Wall Street and the government just comes back home and turns the screws even harder. And it's the working class, sons and daughters, who are going to be sent for these wars. It is the working class who they have to savagely repress if the U.S. imperialists try to pivot towards Asia and take on their biggest rival, a country that did overthrow capitalism.
That's China.
Yeah, it's China. It's China. But I mean, does a day go by that we don't see another crime of U.S. imperialism? And I thought it was very interesting talking to some construction workers at this recent event. They wanted to read the same book that I've been wanting to read for a long time. It's a new book which I can't recommend right now because I haven't read it. But it's called Blue Collar Empire, and it's all about how the AFL-CIO was working hand in glove with U.S. imperialism, especially since World War II, on every bloody anti-communist rampage or clamp down across the world. So that is interesting. I know it's on our minds, so it's an important point, anti-imperialism.
I mean, it's integrally tied to kind of transforming the unions into a fighting force. As you just mentioned, kind of fundamentally, the viewpoint of the union bureaucracy, like to a man, whether they support the liberal Democrats or Trump or, whoever they think they can get the best deal from, is the conception that the U.S. working class's fate rises and falls with U.S. imperialism, and so if you're not kind of taking that on in every circumstance.
And I think in the coming period, we're seeing this already in Britain, but in the coming period, the question of rearmament is going to pose that concretely, right? Because where's that money going to come from? Axing public services, right? So that's one way to make that concrete. All right. I mean, we've been talking for over an hour. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I was wondering, Michael, if I could just end with asking you to bring it back to the question of the party and the paper, right? You edit Workers Vanguard. You try and write or facilitate, articles that are relevant to the class. So what is your takeaway from this conference in terms of future things that the party needs to address?
I think we need to kind of express some of actually what we've just been discussing over the past hour, both in terms of, kind of what the situation is for the class as a whole, kind of the reception that we've had and how, in the reception that advanced workers have had in proposing certain actions, and how to actually, in the face of that, what to actually do. I think that's important because obviously a core part of our readership are advanced. Our other propaganda, I think, is to try to kind of make the case more broadly to the class for particular things like the defense of immigrants, like why the working class as a whole in different sections of it, which are either reluctant to or actually support the anti-immigrant crackdown, why in fact, like what we were saying, why in fact this is putting you in a worse position and is opening you up to really getting hammered very soon, because these attacks are cascading and it's clear things are only going to get worse. There were a number of industries represented, and I do think kind of this individualistic consciousness that we discussed has kind of particular expressions within industry, and there's particular reasons that workers in those industries kind of cling to that, and to really make the case effectively, I think we need to address that individualistic consciousness head on.
I guess, I interpret that as almost an update on what it means to brace.
Yeah, so it would be, in a way, I'm kind of describing brace part 2 or 3 or what have you. Yes, it's a further elaboration. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. We can keep talking, but I am running out of time. But I guess, I just want to conclude by noting that there's many other things that happened in this conference that we weren't able to get to. We talked about, for example, running for union office, working amongst left-wing sort of formations within the union. So there's other things that happen, and we could be talking about this for 5 hours, but maybe in a future episode. Okay, so I think I've run out of questions. I really want to, again, congratulate you. I participated in it, and I thought it was quite successful to just be able to have advanced workers from throughout the country, from different industries, and, of course, from abroad, in a room with other like-minded people, and know that we're not alone out there. And I think, for whoever's listening, you're not alone, get in touch. But I think the other thing I'd just say is all of this, the way to really have solid foundations is also to understand, why is this the way it is, right? Why is this happening? And to that end, Workers Vanguard has written a number of articles. You guys published this article called "Where's the U.S. Going?" that really explains what's led to Trump coming back to the White House, why U.S. imperialism needs Trump. So I'll link those articles in the show notes. And on that note, I think I'm done. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No. Yeah, thanks.
No. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights, experiences that I found very, very valuable. And please get in touch, and we'll see you guys next time.
Great. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
You.